This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. Who is John Galt? Those four words, which open chapter one of Ayn Rand's famous, or to many people, infamous novel, Atlas Shrugged, ignited a firestorm of reaction and consequently polarization when it was first published in 1959. The novel solidified Rand's extreme concept of capitalism, which she had been developing since her family's upscale lifestyle in Russia had been upended by the Bolshevik Revolution. That fanatical form of capitalism, which she named objectivism, was also embraced by devoted cult-like followers. The Rand phenomenon may have become simply a bizarre historic curiosity, if not for the fact that its ideology continues to be espoused by various political and corporate figures, not to mention a puzzling interest by a wide assortment of demographic groups. Lisa Duggan, a professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University, is the author of Mean Girl, which dissects Rand's zealous beliefs and how they influenced and could still be influencing business and political culture. And Lisa joins us today. Glad to have you here today, Lisa.
Hi, happy to be here.
Well, Lisa, I first plowed my way through Atlas Shrugged many years ago. I mean, it was an interesting novel, but I'm really puzzled as to why the underlying theme or themes found any relevance with anyone when it was first published. And I for sure can't figure out why it's still being taken seriously, especially with these high profile corporate and political figures. First of all, can you describe Rand's manifesto and what's your theory about this weird popularity?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that most people read Atlas Shrugged and become fanatical followers of Ayn Rand in high school. So it's people who've been affected by this novel have mostly read it while they were in high school. So it has a tremendous kind of adolescent appeal, right? The theme of the novel, which is about, figures who are fighting against mediocrity to realize their individual potential. They are up against restraints from the family. They're up against the state. They're up against bureaucracy. They're up against all the ways in which they're being held down by a world that doesn't recognize their own individuality. That's a pretty, significant developmental theme of adolescence, right? Is trying to define who you are in relation to family and culture and state and so forth. So also it's sort of, one of the ways that her novels have a huge impact is they're sort of romance novels, right? But they're not written entirely in the sort of feminized genre of romance novels. They're romance novels for boys, although girls read them too. So they have the kind of structure of a Harlequin romance as well. So they're highly sexually charged. And so the sexual charge and the sort of lust-driven interest of the plot also kind of grabs teenage libidos, right? So it's like the romance plot combined with the defining myself in relationship to a fallen world has a very strong impact on adolescents. And then some of those adolescents go on to become fans of Ayn Rand in general. Others realize as they mature what the implications are of a lot of what the plot of Atlas Shrugged is and who Ayn Rand was, and they fall away, right, from being fans of Ayn Rand. So there are many adults in the world who were fans of Ayn Rand in high school who no longer are. But there are also large numbers of people, especially in leadership on the right wing in the United States, who remain fans of Ayn Rand, having read the novels, though, mostly in high school and not really revisited the novels themselves, but have just sort of fastened on to the characters and the plots and some of the feelings. Because she made entrepreneurship in her cartoonish version of it, and capitalism in her extreme and actually quite distorted version of it. She made it both heroic and sexy. So people who then want to be aligned with business interests or with entrepreneurship in an individualist mode, they remember the heroic sexiness of those figures that comes from Ayn Rand novels, and that sort of is the source of their original tie to the figure and to the ideas. That includes a lot of people who never read Ayn Rand. For instance, I'm quite certain Donald Trump never read that novel. He can't read a 10-page memo. I'm sure he never read the novel, but he identifies very strongly with Howard Roark from The Fountainhead, her first big blockbuster novel, because he's a heroic architect, and he has red hair, that he has all these sort of cartoon ideas about Howard Roark, but he didn't get them from reading the novel. He got them in his general sort of right-wing business culture. He got them from other people talking about Howard Roark or valorizing Howard Roark. So some people glom onto Ayn Rand, through the general milieu that they find themselves in, rather than actually having read the novels themselves.
Now, Atlas Shrugged is only one of many publications that Ayn Rand wrote and released in addition to her lectures and her newsletters and her plays. Her first novel was We the Living, I believe. That was published in 1936. How close was that to an autobiography of Ayn Rand, would you say?
That's the novel that she said was the most autobiographical of any of her works of fiction. And it really comes directly out of her experience in Russia. So she was born in Russia at the end of the 19th century to a Russian Jewish family, sort of in St. Petersburg. So the Russian Empire, highly anti-Semitic. There were restrictions on Jewish residency and Jewish citizenship. Her family happened to be part of the very small number of Jews who were permitted to live in St. Petersburg. And her father owned a pharmacy. Her mother had been a dentist and was part of a very small number of privileged Jewish people in St. Petersburg. So she grew up very privileged. Her family had servants. She went to private school. She was tutored in languages, all the sort of privileged childhood of someone who was a child of the elite in Russia. But she was also a member of the Jewish faith, which was reviled in Russia. So it's a very complicated history that she has. But her family was dispossessed during the Russian Revolution. So the Bolsheviks took over her father's pharmacy. Her family fled to the Crimea. And she had the sense that these mobs of inferior people, because she had no understanding of the motivations and the resentments and the politics behind the Russian Revolution. She just saw that what she saw as ignorant, inferior mobs of people took her family's business and her family's well-being away. When they moved back to St. Petersburg and they moved back into their house, they were only allowed to occupy a portion of that house. So even though she went on to study cinematography at the Petrograd State University, which was only free and admitted both women and Jewish people, only because of the Bolsheviks did she get a college education. But she went to Petrograd State University and developed a very powerful antipathy to what she called collectivism, and her anti-socialism, her anti-collectivism, and her impression that socialism was the work of inferior peasants and workers who were dirty and unintelligent, who were taking away the prerogatives of superior people. That impression, which is a 12-year-old's impression, right? That's how old she was when the revolution happened. It's a 12-year-old's impression of what the Russian Revolution was about. But she carried that with her for the rest of her life, and she never modified it. So she maintained that feeling that superior superior people were besieged by the inferior mob, and that capitalism represented the freedom of the superior people, and collectivism represented the aspirations and the unentitled claiming of power by inferior populations. So she maintained that sense, but there was a cross-cutting current in her work that gave it even a wider appeal, because her identification with superiority was complicated by the fact of her being Jewish and her being a woman. So she didn't have really uncomplicated access to pure privilege. So she also had a kind of outsider's rage. Right. She had a sense that there were entitled people who didn't deserve their entitlement, or who were boring compared to the outsider who had a particular edge of anger and ambition that had a real sort of knife's edge to it. So that she did have a sense of being kind of an embittered outsider, as well as being, an advocate of the superior people ruling. So that meant that her work always had this kind of funny two-edged quality to it. On the one hand, a total endorsement of inequality and racial superiority and all kinds of inequality being natural and good. At the same time, that there was this sort of cross-cutting sense that there were angry outsiders who deserved better than they were given or treated. So that combination proved to be, I think, particularly culturally powerful. In a way, if she had just simply been an entitled insider, it wouldn't have had the same emotional edge to it that her fiction and her nonfiction had.
Well, she went on to write her bestseller, The Fountainhead, in 1943, and which we can talk about in a bit. But in the years prior, after moving to the U.S., she somehow managed to find a job as a scriptwriter with Cecil B. DeMille, who is co-founder of Paramount Pictures. He was directing at the time. But how did this young Russian immigrant manage to do that?
Sheer chutzpah. Sheer chutzpah. She went to Hollywood. I mean, she claims she did it all by herself, but of course her family sacrificed quite a bit to get her out of Russia and into the US. And when she arrived penniless in the US, her family in Chicago, her extended family in Chicago, supported her and helped her get to Hollywood. She was always assisted by other people, although she would claim she'd done it all on her own without any support, But her family facilitated her getting to Hollywood. She had been trained in cinematography. She was a complete movie buff. She went to the movies all the time. She kept a movie journal while she was in Russia. All the movies that she saw. She loved Hollywood films. She knew all about them, right? She knew all about the star system and all about all the movies, all the directors. She was a big film buff. So she got to Hollywood and she got a job as an extra, which, not that hard to get a job as an extra on King of Kings. And then she kind of waylaid Cecil B. DeMille, just kind of walked up to him and talked him into hiring her as a screenwriter. So it was pure chutzpah. Her self-belief, was pretty strong, and she just finagled her way in and then talked her way in. I mean, scriptwriter, at first she started out, of course, as a script reader. So she started at the bottom, very much at the bottom. And she never got that far. She did write a few scripts. None of her original scripts were produced. She did do some adaptations that got produced, a couple of adaptations. So she got a little ways in Hollywood, but actually when the talkies came in, she hit a roadblock because her English, though really very good, was not good enough for the talkies. So she really hit a wall and became extremely depressed and angry. And actually the Fountainhead came out of her depression and anger at hitting a wall in Hollywood, which she attributed to, her genius and merit being frustrated by, systems of collectivism that had infected Hollywood. So the Fountainhead, though it's ostensibly about architecture in New York, is actually actually really very much about her experience with the Hollywood film industry, which is thematized throughout the plot of the Fountainhead, which is she went in with this ambition and belief. She had a really tremendous unexpected success, and then she hit a wall. And what she blamed was the sort of mediocrity and failures of the people in Hollywood were responsible for her not being able to get as far as she would have liked.
And the Fountainhead, like Atlas Shrugged, really, I mean, they were both major works, but it was also filled with fantasies and, like you mentioned, many of them erotic or of sexual nature.
Yeah.
Can you give us the plot in a nutshell? I know it'll be a big nutshell, but what was the reaction to that book by the public and by the critics?
I mean, I'll say something about the reaction and go back say something about the plot. The reaction was, it was bad. It got terrible reviews from the critics, from the professional critics, but it got word of mouth, and it slowly built up into a huge bestseller, but it didn't get there by getting positive critical reviews. This was also true of Atlas Shrugged. It got there really by word of mouth. So it was one of those surprise bestsellers that was a bestseller sort of despite the critics. In that way, it shares something with, like the genres like the romance novel or the mystery, right? Novels that have huge sales, but are critically disparaged. So the Fountainhead got bad reviews. It was it became a massive seller, and then it became a Hollywood film. So I'll say that after I go back to say something about the plot of it. So the plot of it is the architect Howard Rourke, who is one of her sort of, masculine, ambitious, contemptuous, doesn't care what other people think, brilliant heroes. So her hero is always some version of the same type. So Howard Rourke is the genius, ambitious architect whose plans are ruined by, on the one hand, architecture by committee, mediocre architects who don't see his individual genius, and instead want to mess with his projects by committee, and also by newspapers, giant newspaper, the Banner, which is run by an editor who, while he admires Howard Rourke, he actually panders to popular opinion. So the pandering newspaper publisher, the mediocre architects by committee, they ruin his project. And so at the end, he blows it up. It's a public housing project, and he blows it up. He blows it up in protest against the way that it was degraded from his initial vision. That character was partly based on Frank Lloyd Wright. So,
see, yes.
Right, modernist architecture. So, and then there's a big trial at the end of the novel where he defends himself and is acquitted by a jury which understands his genius. So, and then he unites with the female hero, who has a rocky road of being involved with all his enemies until she finally is united with this masterful, overbearing sex god, right, who is the architect, who then blows up the building. So that's the cartoon version of the plot. The plot is cartoonish, though, so I'm not cartooning it down much. The other thing that's odd about its massive popularity is that there are huge, long speeches in the book. So some of it are this plot, these characters, this plot, the sex plot, the architecture plot, but she has all these characters giving like 60-page speeches, right, about her philosophical ideas, which is not usually, that doesn't usually go with a best-selling novel. But that was part of how her novel not only got sort of the kind of fan readership that a romance novel would get, but it got a kind of followers of her philosophy, people who then bought her ideas because they were represented throughout the novel in long, boring speeches But the readership was brought in with those things together: the plot, the characters, and the speeches. So it was a surprise bestseller. Absolutely none, or very few. There were only one or two critics that gave it a positive review. Mostly overwhelmingly critical reviews. It was a massive success. And so there was a film made of it, starring Gary Cooper and Patricia Neal. And she was actually flooded with requests, from all the major stars of the day: Humphrey Bogart, Joan Crawford, right, who all wanted to be in this movie. But then she interfered substantially. She was on the set of the movie, interfering constantly. And she made the film have the kind of rigidity and didacticism that her writing has. So the film was actually quite unsuccessful. And then she was very angry, when the film was unsuccessful. But she's the one who was on the set every day, trying to put her ideas and her more rigid characterizations into a film, which were not very cinematic. They worked in the novel. This popular readership, but they didn't work in the film, so the film was a failure. And so she returned to New York. She went back to New York, and that's where she both started took her 13 years to write Atlas Shrugged, and during that time, her followers also founded the philosophical club that became a cult, really, objectivism in New York, after the Fountainhead, the film, flopped.
And it was about this time that Rand completed her, her first nonfiction work, The Individualist Manifesto. And that's what she came up with, her famous slogan, "Individualists of the world unite." What was the significance?
Contradictory, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. I thought that was a joke at first, but I've seen the T-shirt before. What was the significance of the manifesto at this time of her career?
Well, so she got involved in politics in New York, and she was opposed to the New Deal and the welfare state. So she got behind the candidacy of Wilkie in New York, and she became she started propagandizing on the street. She was very thrilled with the impact of her doing so. It made her hate the common people less, because she had a very sympathetic audience when she went around campaigning, and she also joined a reading group with Isabel Patterson, who's a right-wing writer in New York, who had a reading group that was more American in its reading of philosophy than the European philosophy that Ayn Rand had previously read. So she became more willing to consider that the common man might not be a total inferior monster. Based on the reading that she did in American Revolutionary History with Isabel Patterson. But so she decided that the way that the right wing could compete with the left would be to produce something that was as compelling, both emotionally and intellectually, as the Communist Manifesto. So she decided the left had all of these powerful, emotionally moving ideas and writing, and that the right wing should have something similar. So she wrote the Individualist Manifesto, consciously modeled on the Communist Manifesto, though it's funny to read because of all the internal contradictoriness, right, of the idea of calling on individualists to unite. It was pretty widely circulated. It got a version of it got printed in the Reader's Digest. But she didn't continue with her external political work, because she withdrew to finish this. Finishing the Atlas Shrugged was tremendously difficult. It took her a long time. She struggled with it. She became a Benzedrine addict while she was writing it. Uppers. She became addicted to uppers while writing the novel, because she was under a lot of pressure. She had a deadline. She was trying to finish it, and the work on it was prolonged and difficult. So she withdrew pretty much from the political world. And it was her very close community of objectivists who basically then ran this new objectivist club, objectivist society, on her behalf while she was finishing Atlas Shrugged.
Well, as you called it in your book, that group was a weird little group of followers.
Yes.
Now, according to one of the founding members, as you mentioned in there, Nathaniel Brandon, his memoir in 1986 said that it was brutal to be a member of that group. It was very cult-like. Tell us about that, and why would anyone want to belong to it?
And he was, lead brute. I mean, he confessed later about the brutality of it because he became the object of the brutality of it. But initially, he was one of the lead brutes, right, who brutalized everybody else. Well, it had all the dynamics of a classic cult, right? When you read about classic cults, the charismatic leader, followers who are fanatically devoted, who are disciplined in the one true belief and the one true leader. Like if you're reading about Scientology, or if you're reading about the Nexium cult, right, in New York, it's always that kind of mystery for both psychologists and sociologists to decipher how people become cult members, how they become followers of charismatic leaders and believers in an entire system of thought that they are not permitted to deviate from. It's particularly ironic and interesting in the case of objectivism, because objectivism was devoted to free thought, but it didn't allow free thought, right? So that in order to be a member of this a group that was devoted to reason and free thought, you needed to sign on to every single thing that Ayn Rand believed, right? And if you didn't, that's when there was discipline and expulsion from the group. And they used individual psychology sessions with an individual psychologist, like Nathaniel Brandon was a psychologist, to browbeat people into accepting the tenets of the group. So it was so there's an inner circle that was relatively small. It was called the collective, and then there was a larger group of people who took the classes and went to the meetings. And then there was the yet larger group of people who just read the newsletter. So there were, layers of participation in objectivism. Another one of there's so many contradictions, sort of framing contradictions involved. So Ayn Rand declared herself an atheist. She was very disidentified with Jewishness as a religion. She also was against sort of the family as a structure. She didn't think you should choose alliance based on blood and ethnicity. And so she was not close to members of her own family. She was not an advocate. Her novels were mostly adulterous affairs. Most of them were. There was no childbearing. There's only one thing she ever wrote that had a love affair that led to a kind of couple, a reproductive couple, and that was Anthem. The rest of the time, she had a lot of triangles and quadrangles, and so she wasn't about the family, and she wasn't a fan of religion. However, her inner circle was made up almost entirely of Eastern European descended Jews, most of whom were either related to each other or knew each other from childhood. So it's a very contradictory thing. Her inner formation was exactly formed on the very basis that the group itself eschewed, right? I mean, and she would not be aware, and no one would have said that people were chosen based on their religious background, right, or their family affiliations, yet they were all religiously and familially related in this very small group, which happened to include Alan Greenspan.
Yes.
The famous head of the Fed, the guru head of the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, was part of the inner circle. And at his when he was first brought into the Ford administration for the Council of Economic Advisors, there's Ayn Rand is at his swearing, is the photograph of his swearing in. Ayn Rand is present. So he was an Ayn Randian in the very inner circle. So, and then, then that inner circle had this school, and people came to classes where they were taught objectivism. And then there was the newsletter. So there were people farther afield that read the newsletter. Objectivist groups were created in many cities, reproduced themselves. There were lecture series that were sent out on cassette tapes. And people listened to the objectivism lessons on cassette tapes. So objectivism, it was a cult, and then it was sort of a membership group. It was never really huge. Her major influence is through her fiction, not through the nonfiction, the objectivism and the nonfiction. It's mainly through the circulation of her fiction. But she was the sort of cult leader of this small group, which in the end is what really destroyed her ability to continue to write and produce and even eventually appear in public, because she had she married Frank O'Connor, who was a film extra on King of Kings also, who was like, from central casting as her heroic manly man, right? He was like beautiful in that Hollywood masculine way. And she chose him because he looked like her hero figure. In fact, by all reports, he was a very sweet man. He was a florist. He liked to raise peacocks. He was very passive. He was sort of the host at her events, and he eventually drank himself to death. So she was married to him, but she had a secret affair with, originally his name was Nathan Blumenthal, and he changed it to Nathaniel Brandon. So Nathaniel Brandon, she had an affair with Nathaniel Brandon, which was secret for a very long time. And he also was married to another member of the inner cult. When he took on yet another lover, Ayn Rand had like a meltdown, and she denounced him to the whole objectivist world, and she denounced him on dishonest terms, right? I mean, she said that he had committed fraud, that he was not the hero she thought he was. She denounced, she never said why, she never revealed the affair or the sense of being jilted that actually motivated her rage. She came up with a whole set of justifications for why she was denouncing him. And it split their movement. And eventually both of the two Brandons wrote their own books talking about what actually happened. And the cult of objectivism was pretty much destroyed by the exposure of that affair. And then Ayn Rand pretty much never recovered from that. So that was in 1968 that happened. So that's, again, the incredible contradictions of her rationalist philosophy and her actions being driven by emotion, right? By really strong emotion, and emotion that she then never really tried to account for. She even claimed right in her writing that sexual attraction was purely rational, that sexual attraction is based on recognizing the superior type of person. When you recognize the superior type of person, that is sexual attraction. So it's based on a rational assessment of superior attributes. And if you have a sexual attraction based on anything else, then you're an inferior person who's motivated by inferior motives.
Now, you were also talking about Alan Greenspan as part of that group, and but her adherents weren't limited to politicians. There's also the contemporary corporate entrepreneurs who have spoken that they're admirers. Supposedly, individuals like Steve Jobs and Peter Thiel and Mark Cuban, Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia, they were all that greatly influenced by your ideologies?
She has a big fan base in Silicon Valley. So she has three overlapping fan bases in sort of worlds of power and privilege. One is Silicon Valley, right, where the cult of the individual entrepreneur is really pretty profound, right? People who see themselves as pure creative achievers who are in some sense only hemmed in by government regulation and inferior people. That's very common in Silicon Valley. Also business CEOs, especially for some reason banking executives, but she has a big fan base among CEOs, right? Among the sort of Koch world, libertarian corporate elite. And then she has a fan base among, and this is actually quite ironic, among politicians, because she was not a fan of the kind of politicians who compromise and use the state. And someone like Donald Trump would, to her, be a kind of, a villain, right? Because of his crony capitalism and his pandering to religion and all the things that Trump does, she was very contemptuous of. But he is a fan of hers, as were, many of the people in his cabinet, so you'll find many sort of people's yachts named after Howard Rourke, or there are a lot of venture capital funds and private equity stuff that are named after John Galt, or right. There's lots of people in the world of either of Silicon Valley moguls or business elite or conservative right-wing politicians who are among her fan base. Also, some people in the cultural elite too, but it's less strong there than it is in Silicon Valley, more conventional business, corporate business, and in right-wing political circles. So so like many of those people probably have not read her novels. They just picked up The Cult of Ayn Rand from their milieu. Others probably read her in high school and became devotees that helped fuel their ambition and their vision of themselves as heroic, sexy entrepreneurs, and held on to that. So she's had just a really astonishing impact as a kind of cultural figure, who provides both a sense that capitalism is the only moral, that the entrepreneur who just is selfish and ambitious is moral, that's true morality, and also is the one who is really sexy. So both morality and sexiness she attributes to this kind of figure of unbridled greed, right? Who just doesn't worry about the impact on other people, has no concern for the poor or for any other, the impact of their business on the environment or on other people, that kind of business practice and set of feelings and concepts attached to a kind of greedy capitalism that is aggressively unconcerned with the impact on other people. That is, Ayn Rand has been an important influence and a cultural figure there, as someone who provides both a kind of philosophical justification, like for greed is good, going back to that first Wall Street film, very, very Randian, and also to the sense of being sort of a sexy, ambitious figure. Those are drawn from, Ayn Rand isn't their sole source, but she's a major reference point for that kind of both moralizing and making sexy, the greedy, self-dealing, ambitious, no concern for anyone else, kind of figure in business, especially.
Yeah, and when you talk about that political and the corporate aspect, I mean, you speak a lot about the current day neoliberalism, those elements that have been greatly influenced by her. Yet she didn't necessarily subscribe to that idea of neoliberalism, did she? I mean, that's a pretty big term.
She died before neoliberalism really got going. Neoliberalism didn't get going until the 80s, as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Although neoliberalism, in its greed is good, cut the social safety net, I mean, the tenets of neoliberalism were and are to cut the social safety net, right? Cut Social Security, cut Medicare, cut all kinds of guaranteed pensions and all the social services, deregulate business, right? To the big push to deregulate in the 90s, especially, and that is those are two of the big policy fronts of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism drew on the image and the ideas and the feelings that came from Ayn Rand to justify those kinds of policy interventions. But I just also want to say that neoliberalism is in crisis and decline right now. So neoliberalism as a policy, a political position, and a set of policies is under attack from both the left and the right. And the sort of like, say, let's take a figure like Peter Thiel, right, who starts out as an Ayn Randian, right, an anti-regulation, free trade, free, capitalist, anti-government figure. Well, and he's now kind of a neo-monarchist, Peter Thiel. And he bankrolled J.D. Vance, right, who the figure, right-wing kind of Trumpist figure who just ran for office. He's moved in this direction of embracing authoritarian means for keeping profits high and business going. So that is not Randian. So Ayn Rand was consistently anti-authoritarian and consistently anti-government intervention. And the right wing is now the conservatives and the right wing are like a funny conflicting overlap, convergence of people from the old anti-regulationist, right, neoliberal right, someone like Mitch McConnell, right, and or the Koch brothers, and people who have now turned to using a kind of populist rhetoric and a nationalist rhetoric in order to promote authoritarianism and cultural war. But those two things they're in contradiction, but they also overlap in the current formations of the political formations that are at work right now. Take, for instance, Trump is a very good illustration of that, in that his administration got in with a lot of the populist rhetoric and the nationalist rhetoric, but what they actually did was cut taxes for the rich, right? I mean, the accomplishments of the Trump administration were, on policy terms, a lot of the old anti-free, anti-regulationist, cutting the social safety net goals of the more classic neoliberals. So I don't mean to complicate this too much, but just to say, Ayn Rand has been an enormous influence on the anti-regulationist, free trade, capitalist class. But and those people who admire her are very much in power in Silicon Valley, in the government and so forth. But right now, that kind of pure 1990s, early 2000s neoliberalism is in crisis and decline, and the kind of authoritarianism and populism that's coming up from the right, as well as the populism, the left populism, like the Bernie Sanders, AOC populism, are contesting that formation, and so it's in a kind of political crisis. And Ayn Rand really represents that formation that's in crisis. Although some of the people who are her fans have moved over into the authoritarian right, like Peter Thiel, right? So. Mm-hmm. And Trump, right, who start out as fans of Ayn Rand and then move over into a more authoritarian populism, which Ayn Rand was adamantly and purely opposed to. So it's complicated in that way. She's still a huge influence, but on this particular piece of the current political formation.
Well, despite the fact that she still has those fans, the latter stages of her life were not necessarily pleasant. What were her final years like?
Well, she died, isolated and alone. She really had almost no friends left. She she was on Social Security. A lot of people make a joke out of that. She had a pretty miserable, the last years of her life were pretty miserable. There were only the very sort of objectivist, the very, very tiny core of objectivist leadership were still trying to take care of her. But so the end of her life after 1968, she had a little heyday as a kind of speaker, on the campus circuit. She was a semi-popular speaker on the campus circuit. And then she really went into a fairly dramatic decline. She had lung cancer, though she denied it. She'd smoked all her life. She denied that had anything to do with the lung cancer because she was very pro-smoking and anti any restrictions on tobacco. But so she died of lung cancer on Social Security, right? Someone who opposed regulations on tobacco and also opposed Social Security. But her ideas took off again after her death. So it's after her death. She died in 1982, and her ideas took off again. They had a huge little surge in the 1990s, the 80s and into the 90s, and then they had a huge resurgence 2008, 2009 around the Tea Party, the economic crash, and the emergence of the Tea Party. So all of those, Tea Party rallies, a lot of people had "Who is John Galt" signs and so forth at Tea Party rallies. She had a big heyday. Her books, started becoming bestsellers again. Her novels, right after 2008, there was a huge spike in her sales. So she's had this, this posthumous life that has been. Only a few years ago, a very renowned Belgian gay social democratic playwright did a production of the Fountainhead in New York City that had got good reviews and had a huge audience of sort of the cultural elite of New York City, with not everyone observing the full thematic implications of that text. So it's had, a lot of lives. Almost her greatest popularity has come after her death. And
who knew that a little Russian immigrant girl would have that kind of influence on the United States of America?
It's pretty remarkable. It's really pretty remarkable and strange,
strange, yes.
Yeah. And another reason I wrote about her was that people tend to dismiss her, right? People tend to say, well, she was a hack writer. They were lousy novels. Her philosophy is completely simple-minded. Why should anybody pay any attention to Ayn Rand? But the reason we should pay attention to her is because she's had such an impact. When we look at the impact of economic ideas and and of economists and intellectuals and institutions, I think we also need to look at the role of popular figures like Ayn Rand in order to understand why something like this culture of greed, which has gripped the United States so powerfully, how it sustains itself is not entirely through, the beliefs of economists and the World Bank, right? It's also because ideas that come to be broadly disseminated, like through the novels of Ayn Rand, have an enormous impact, and we ignore that or denigrate that at our peril in terms of understanding like what it is we're up against when we want to counter a culture of cruelty and greed that is very widespread in the United States and other parts of the world right now.
Well, Lisa, I do thank you so much for providing some perspective about this strange world of Ayn Rand and her devotees.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thank you so much.
And I thank all of you for tuning in to Outrageous History. And remember, for additional information about this and other podcast topics, as well as more information about our authors and historians, log on to www.outrageoushistory.com. I'm Ernest Granson, and this is Outrageous History. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.